What is the line a child would never cross? The story you're about to hear will shatter every assumption you have about family. A daughter didn't just abandon, but sealed the fate of her own mother and grandmother in a desolate cabin, a place with no people and no hope. They were forgotten. But from the very depths of that oblivion, a truth both painful and extraordinary began to grow. Because sometimes the most horrific tragedies come from true stories. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. Some stories, no matter how painful, must be told. Scarlett shoved the suitcase into the trunk of the car with a force that revealed more anger than exhaustion. The movement was clumsy and loaded with a silence that weighed more than the suitcases themselves. She was breathing heavily, not from the physical effort, but because every inch that suitcase moved was a symbol of the decision she was making. A decision that tore up roots and shattered memories, even though she tried to convince herself otherwise. The metal of the Ford echoed with a dull thud as it took the luggage, and that sound hung in the air like a bell announcing the beginning of something irreversible. Michael, who watched her standing by the door, muttered coldly that the house was dead money, and his words were not advice or a casual comment, but a sentence loaded with ambition that embedded itself in Scarlett's chest like a nail. He said it without raising his voice much, but with the confidence of someone who believes they are right, as if the walls of the old house where Linda and Helen lived held no stories or memories, as if they were just bricks without emotional value. Scarlett heard that phrase, and her jaw tensed. Her eyes shone for a moment, not with tenderness, but with a poisonous mixture of resentment and need. And although she didn't answer out loud, inside she repeated those words until she convinced herself that she had to take the step she was about to take. Meanwhile, Linda gently caressed her mother Helen's shoulder, a brief but desperate gesture of tenderness. Her fingers trembled slightly, not just from age, but because she knew that this touch might be the last way to tell her without words that she was by her side, that she was not abandoning her in the midst of the chaos. Helen, at 92 years old, looked up at the gray sky and remained silent, as if she understood everything and preferred to keep quiet, because she had learned that sometimes silence protects more than words. The wind rustled her white hair, and her tired eyes seemed to hold the weight of entire generations, as if she could see beyond that painful moment. Linda swallowed hard and wanted to speak. She wanted to stop her daughter. She wanted to scream that this was not the way, but the fear of losing her forever sealed her lips, and so her only voice was that trembling caress on her mother's shoulder. The truck started with a metallic roar. The engine vibrated strongly and kicked up a cloud of dust that covered the dirt road like a dirty veil. That dust seemed to swallow the house, the trees, and the memories left behind. And in the rearview mirror, the faces of Linda and Helen blurred as if they were ghosts that no longer belonged to Scarlett's life. Inside the truck, the air was filled with a thick silence, interrupted only by the rattling of the engine and the sound of Scarlett's ragged breathing as she gripped the steering wheel, as if her strength depended on not stopping, as if letting go meant turning back. Michael, sitting beside her, watched the road with a restrained smile, sure that they had done the right thing, sure that leaving those two women behind was just a necessary step to open the doors to the wealth he craved. He didn't look back once. He didn't look in the rearview mirror, because for him there was nothing worth looking at. All that mattered was ahead, in the promise of selling the house and getting what he called a better future. Scarlett, on the other hand, although she kept her eyes fixed on the road, couldn't help but feel something burning inside her, a mixture of anger and guilt, a pang of pain she tried to drown out, reminding herself not to look back. The dust the truck kicked up swirled with the wind and seemed to form figures, as if the air itself wanted to scream that something was being lost, that a wound was opening in that instant. The town was left behind with its narrow streets, its familiar voices, its memories woven into every corner, and instead, ahead, there was only a rough road surrounded by hills and silence, a road that promised nothing more than distance. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was a contained storm, a battle between what the heart screamed and what reason, or at least what Scarlett wanted to call reason, tried to impose. Michael commented again that soon they would be free of burdens and could finally live as they deserved. And Scarlett nodded without looking at him, because if she looked at him, she was afraid he would see the truth in her eyes. That truth that haunted her, even though she tried to ignore it, that what they were leaving behind was not a burden, but the very soul of their family history. The truck kept moving forward, and every yard was a sentence, every vibration of the engine, a painful heartbeat that marked the rhythm of a wordless farewell. The dust continued to rise in whirlwinds that looked like ghostly hands trying to hold them back, and the evening shadows stretched across the road as if they wanted to wrap them in a silent warning. Scarlett bit her lips so hard she almost drew blood, because inside her there was a suppressed scream, a scream that said this wasn't right, but she smothered it by repeating Michael's words, convincing herself that the house was dead money, that those two women were just an obstacle, that to move forward she had to let go of what tied her down. However, deep in her chest, she knew that what she was letting go of was not an obstacle, but the last bond that kept her connected to what was once home. The truck didn't stop. There was no turning back, only the roar of the engine, the dust covering the street, and two women left behind, wrapped in silence, holding each other, while the world around them seemed to slowly crumble. And so the departure began, with an abandonment disguised as a decision, with an uncertain future born from an act of betrayal, and with a wound that was just beginning to open in everyone's heart, even Scarlett's, though she refused to admit it. The truck stopped in front of a deserted cabin that seemed lost in the middle of the pine trees of northern Michigan. A humble wooden structure, worn by rain and sun, with windows covered in dust and cobwebs, as if time had condemned it to oblivion. The engine vibrated for a few more seconds before shutting off, and in the silence that followed, the distant caw of a crow and the creaking of branches stirred by the wind could be heard. Scarlett breathed heavily as she gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if she needed to squeeze it to keep from trembling. And when she looked up at the cabin, her eyes shone with a strange fire, a mixture of determination and fear. Michael, sitting beside her, snorted impatiently and told her it was time to end all this drama, that the old women would be better off here than being in the way in the city. Scarlett nodded with a slight movement of her head and then got out of the truck, slamming the door with a bang that echoed in the air like a sentence. She walked to the other side of the vehicle, yanked open the back door, and without looking at her mother or grandmother, said in a dry voice that they would rest better here, that the country would do them good, that at least in this place they would find peace. The sentence came out harsh, sharp, as if she wanted to convince herself more than them. And as she said it, she avoided meeting Linda's eyes, because she knew that in those eyes she would find the plea and the pain she feared so much. Linda slowly got out of the truck, resting a trembling hand on the doorframe, and when she felt the cold ground under her feet, she shivered as if she had descended into an alien world, a place that didn't belong to her. Her lips moved without making a sound, trying to form words that never came out, and she just looked at her mother Helen, who was still sitting with her back straight, clutching the small purse she held in her lap, as if inside it held not just a handkerchief and a rosary, but the memory of a lifetime. Helen looked up at the pine trees surrounding the cabin. She observed them with a mixture of distrust and resignation, and her eyes narrowed as she saw how the wind made the branches creak, as if they were voices whispering ancient warnings. Her breathing was slow but deep, and when Linda helped her out, she supported herself on her cane with the dignity of someone who does not let herself be defeated by age or circumstances. Scarlett went ahead, pushed open the cabin door abruptly, and the screech of the rusty hinges echoed like a lament in the middle of the woods. Inside, The air was thick with dust and dampness, with a smell of rotten wood that mixed with the silence of years, a silence that hurt the ears like a reproach. Scarlett took a step back, picked up a water jug from the truck, and with a final, cruel gesture, poured its contents onto the dusty ground before leaving the empty container at the entrance. The act was a silent, deliberate message. They were being left with nothing. Then she turned to Linda and Helen, avoided looking them in the face, and with a quick movement slammed the door shut, a slam that seemed to seal fate. Michael walked over to the truck and said it was for the best, that now they could move forward without those burdens. And Scarlett nodded again, but her breathing became heavier, as if suddenly every breath reminded her that she had left her mother and grandmother in an abandoned place. Linda tried to speak, raising her voice just enough to call out to Scarlett, but her daughter didn't answer. She just got into the truck and started the engine with trembling hands. Helen, who was watching everything in silence, said in a low but firm tone that the trees had seen crueler acts and that the forest would know how to keep a memory of what was happening there. A sentence that rumbled in the air like a curse or an undeniable truth. Linda looked at her with unshed tears, and although she wanted to reply, she only managed to whisper that she didn't understand how her own daughter could have gone so far. Scarlett, inside the truck, pressed her lips together when she heard her mother's voice, but she didn't turn her head because if she did, she knew her eyes would reveal the crack of guilt that was beginning to open inside her. Michael put his hand on her shoulder and told her not to doubt that she was doing the right thing, that there was no room for weakness. The truck started again. The dust rose again on the road, and as the wheels moved away, Linda and Helen were left standing in front of the cabin, wrapped in a silence that hurt more than any word. The air among the pines was cold, the evening shadows were lengthening, and the violently closed door looked like an open wound in the middle of that lonely landscape. Linda held her mother's hand tightly, and Helen, without taking her eyes off the cloud of dust that was moving away, murmured that life always finds a way to put everyone in their place. And although she said it calmly, a certainty shone in her eyes that neither betrayal nor abandonment could erase. The silence inside the cabin was so dense it felt like a damp cloth sticking to the skin, broken only by the wind that seeped through the cracks in the walls and made the wood creak as if the whole house were groaning under the weight of abandonment. Linda walked slowly across the dust-covered floor. Each step raised small clouds that floated in the air and irritated her throat, but she didn't stop walking, searching with her eyes for any sign that this place could offer them shelter. She bent over the old iron stove, covered in rust and dry soot, and turned the knob, hoping to hear a hiss of gas that would allow her to light a flame, but there was nothing. Only the metallic screech of a broken mechanism that no longer responded. At that moment, she felt despair settle on her chest like a block of stone, and she turned her head towards her mother with glassy eyes, trying to hide the helplessness that was consuming her. Helen, sitting on a wooden bench that wobbled under her weight, watched everything with the calm of someone who has seen too much in life to be surprised by cruelty. And when Linda murmured in a broken voice that the stove didn't work, she replied with a whisper that cut through the air like a dagger, saying that they had not been left any food. Her words were not a reproach, but a cold diagnosis of reality. And in that instant, the echo of that phrase filled the empty space, as if the walls themselves were repeating the lament. This is what true hopelessness feels like. It's not just the cold or the empty stove, it's the crushing weight of being forgotten by your own blood. In a moment like this, a person can either surrender to the darkness or find a strength they never knew they had. The choice Linda and Helen make next will define them. Linda felt her throat tighten, not just from the dust, but from the shame and guilt that tore at her. Because in some corner of her heart, she still resisted accepting that her own daughter could have left them there, without bread, without water, without even a gesture of farewell. Outside, a crow cawed loudly, a harsh sound that pierced the silence like a dark warning, and the flapping of its wings echoed on the rusty tin roof, as if announcing a bad omen. The cawing lasted for a few seconds and then faded into the distance, but it remained engraved in the memory of both women as a reminder that they were alone in the middle of an indifferent forest, surrounded by life that did not care about them. Linda slumped down next to the broken stove, covering her face with her hands, and in a muffled sob, said she didn't understand how Scarlett could have looked them in the eye and still abandoned them in a place like this. Helen with difficulty planted her cane on the floor, leaned towards her, and replied that anger ages faster than the years, that they should save their strength to survive, not to curse. Helen's serenity, her way of facing tragedy with an almost implacable temper, moved Linda to the core, and although her tears continued to flow, she took Helen's wrinkled hand and kissed it with the devotion of a lost child. The air inside the cabin was so cold it felt like needles on the skin. The wind whistled through the cracks in the door and stirred the remnants of hanging cobwebs, and every corner spoke of neglect, with furniture covered in dust, cracked walls, and a floor that creaked as if protesting every movement. Linda rose slowly and scanned the space, looking for something that could be of use to them. But all she found was an old rusty bucket, a broken chair, and a pile of wood that could perhaps be lit as a fire. She approached the window and saw how the shadows of the pine trees lengthened in the late afternoon, as if the trees themselves were leaning towards them to observe them. And she thought of the irony that nature enveloped them in beauty and threat at the same time. She said in a low voice that at least they would have the forest, that perhaps they could find herbs or water. And Helen replied that the earth never abandons those who respect it, but that they had to learn to listen to it. Linda nodded with a lump in her throat, because she understood that the emptiness they felt was not just physical, it was not just hunger and cold, it was also the emptiness of feeling discarded by someone to whom they had given life. And that pain was much harder to fill than any empty plate. Outside, the wind blew harder, and the crow's caw was heard again, this time accompanied by the cracking of branches falling to the ground, and that sound mixed with Linda's racing heartbeat, who for the first time felt a deep fear of the approaching night. Helen, on the other hand, remained upright, her gaze fixed on the non-existent fire of the stove, and murmured that they had been through many storms and that this would be just one more, although inside she knew that this wound was different, because there was no storm crueler than that of abandonment. Linda went outside the cabin with slow but determined steps. The icy wind from the forest hit her face and made her squint, but she didn't stop because she knew that if she didn't find a way to light a fire, that first night would be unbearable. The ground was covered with dry leaves and broken branches, some damp from past rains, others crisp and fragile like old bones. She began to collect them one by one, bending down with effort and filling her arms until she could barely hold the weight. Every time she bent down, she felt a sharp pain in her back, a reminder of the years and the accumulated fatigue, but she told herself that she had to endure because now her mother's life depended on that small fire. Upon re-entering the cabin, she dropped the branches onto the packed earth floor. The noise echoed in the empty space, like drums announcing a struggle for survival. She knelt beside the pile of wood and began to arrange it clumsily, trying to remember how she had seen the farmers of her childhood do it, but her hands trembled and the branches slipped away as if they had a will of their own. Helen, watching her from the unstable bench where she sat, took a deep breath and in a serene voice told her not to worry, that every fire is born of patience, and she leaned forward to show her how to arrange the thinner pieces in the shape of a pyramid, leaving a gap in the center where the air could fan the flame. Linda listened attentively, feeling a mixture of shame and gratitude, because despite her 70 years, she still needed her mother's teachings, and she obeyed every instruction with the obedience of a child trying to learn an ancient art. When she finally managed to strike a spark with a damp match she had found in her purse, the small flame flickered uncertainly, on the verge of dying, but with a careful breath she protected it, and little by little saw it grow into an improvised fire that filled the cabin with a warm, wavering light. The feeling of relief was so intense that Linda couldn't stop a tear from rolling down her cheek. And looking at her, Helen smiled with proud tenderness, as if the flame not only illuminated the room, but also the dignity they had thought lost. As the embers grew, Helen pointed to a small bunch of herbs that Linda had brought in with the branches. And with that firm voice that she hadn't lost even at 92, she explained that those dandelion greens could be eaten, but the other one couldn't. That one nourished, and the other could make you sick. Linda listened with the desperate attention of someone who knows that the difference between life and death is in the details, and she repeated her mother's words in a low voice, as if they were a prayer she had to memorize forever. She bent down to cut a stem, and as she placed it in the improvised pot, the heat of the fire surprised her, and her fingers brushed directly against the embers. The pain was immediate and sharp, a burning sensation that tore a muffled cry from her, and she dropped the stem clumsily as she brought her hand to her mouth, trying to soothe the burn. Helen got up with effort, leaning on her cane, and with a speed that belied her years, she took her daughter's injured hand and blew on it gently, murmuring that fire teaches respect with pain, but that every wound calms down if it is attended to in time. Linda closed her eyes and let out a restrained sob, not only because of the burning on her skin, but because in that gesture she felt her mother giving her back a piece of love that she had thought impossible to recover in the midst of so much misfortune. Helen's breath was warm, full of the sweetness that time had never taken from her. And in that instant, Linda understood that, despite the years and the abandonment, she was still the daughter protected by her mother's wise hands. When the pain subsided a little, they both sat by the fire, and Linda took the old rusty bucket she had found in a corner of the cabin. She filled it with water from the nearby stream that she had brought with effort in a cracked container, and placed it on the embers until it began to boil with a bubbling murmur. The steam filled the air with a humid heat that caressed their faces, and the metallic smell of the container mixed with the smoke from the wood, creating a harsh but strangely comforting atmosphere. When the water was ready, Linda carefully poured it into a rusty can that still had its rim intact, and held it with both hands as the heat burned her palms. Helen looked at her, and with a tired smile told her to share, that even the simplest water became a feast when it was shared with love. Linda first brought the can to her mother's lips and watched her drink slowly, with her eyes closed as if that sip were a treasure. Then she took a drink herself, feeling the warm liquid go down her throat and giving her the illusion of being nourished, even though she knew it was just water. That can pass several times from one hand to another, and each time it did, the gesture became more intimate, more human, as if in that exchange they were not only sharing water, but also hope. The fire crackled, the night wore on, and the wind continued to seep through the cracks. But in the middle of that abandoned cabin, two women found a way to resist together, to transform nothingness into a small refuge, and to remember that as long as they had each other, the darkness would never be complete. Linda could no longer bear the weight of everything she had been dragging since the moment the truck drove away, leaving them in that abandoned cabin, and her heart suddenly broke like an old vase that could no longer withstand the pressure. The makeshift fire in front of them crackled with sharp sounds that seemed like small laments, and the orange glow illuminated the wrinkles on her face, marked by exhaustion, highlighting each line as if they were scars on her soul. Sitting on the packed earth floor, with her hands covering her face, Linda let out a heartbreaking cry that echoed inside the cabin like an unbearable echo, and between sobs she could barely articulate in a broken voice, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for not knowing how to protect you. I'm sorry for not having enough strength to stand up to Scarlett. I'm sorry for being silent when I should have screamed. I'm sorry for accepting the unacceptable." Her words were a contained river that finally overflowed, and each tear that fell on her cheeks burned more than the fire, because it was the reflection of a guilt that was consuming her. Helen watched her in silence, with her tired eyes that seemed to see beyond the immediate. And at that moment she understood that there was no room for reproaches, that the only thing that could save them from sinking into pain was to rescue the tenderness they still had left. With a slow and dignified gesture, she extended her trembling hand and took Linda's chin firmly, forcing her to lift her head and look her in the eyes. Her voice came out clear and strong, as if within that old woman still lived the indomitable woman who had raised her children amidst poverty and the harshness of the countryside. And she told her not to ask for forgiveness, that she was protecting her now, that this act of lighting the fire, of bringing water from the stream, of searching for food in the earth, was the greatest proof of love a daughter could give her mother. Linda remained motionless, her eyes wide and tears suspended on her cheeks, because she did not expect to hear those words. She did not expect her mother to free her from guilt with such simplicity. She let out a choked sigh and clung to Helen's hand, feeling the hidden strength that still throbbed in those wrinkled fingers. And for a moment, she was again the child who took refuge in her mother's lap when storms battered the old house where they had lived. The fire continued to burn, sending sparks into the cold air. And in that atmosphere heavy with smoke and memories, Linda and Helen began to talk about things they hadn't remembered for years. It was Helen who, with a mischievous twinkle in her eyes, recalled a saying she used to repeat when Linda was little. And upon saying it in a hoarse voice, they both looked at each other in surprise and suddenly burst into unexpected laughter, a laughter that shook their entire bodies and echoed off the cabin walls like a forgotten melody coming back to life. Linda covered her mouth with her hand, still crying, but this time her tears were different. They were a sweet relief born from their recovered complicity. And Helen, laughing with trembling shoulders, told her that there was no helping it, that they had always been equally stubborn. And that sincere confession united them in an instant, as if the years of distance had dissolved in the smoke of the fire. The contrast between the cold seeping through the cracks and the warmth of the fire became a symbol of what they were experiencing. Abandonment had cast them out into the open, but the love that still existed between them wrapped them in an invisible coat more powerful than any blanket. Linda moved closer to her mother, leaned over her, and wrapped her arms around her, burying her face in Helen's bony, warm shoulder. And in that embrace, not only their bodies merged, but also all the guilt, resentment, and fears that had separated them. Helen responded by pressing her against her chest with a surprising strength for someone her age, and murmured that as long as they were together, nothing and no one could destroy them, that even in the cruelest loneliness, family could be a beacon capable of illuminating the deepest darkness. They remained like that for a long time, with the crackling of the fire as their only witness, and in that shared silence, the bond that Scarlett had tried to break was rewoven. This is the moment everything shifts. It's no longer about what they've lost, but about what they still have, each other. But as the years pass in isolation, will this bond be enough? A visitor is coming, one who will change their fate forever. The wind continued to blow outside. The forest remained immense and threatening. But inside that cabin, in front of a lit fire and under the warmth of an embrace, Linda and Helen recovered the most important thing they had left. The certainty that as long as they had each other, there would always be a chance to start over. Months turned into a year, then 5, then 10. The wind, the fire, and the silence became their only companions. The constant sound of the crackling fire was the heartbeat of their shared survival. Linda's hands, once soft, were now calloused from chopping wood and foraging. Helen, though her body grew frail, her spirit remained a fortress. They learned the forest secrets, which roots to eat, where to find water in the dry season, how to read the stars. They had survived, but a part of them had frozen in time, waiting for a past that never returned. Then one evening, after a decade of isolation, A strange noise interrupted that fragile calm. It was a firm, determined step, heard approaching from outside, a dull thud against the damp earth, followed by the crunch of branches breaking under boots that seemed not to hesitate. Linda tensed immediately. Her breathing became irregular, and her hands instinctively sought to protect her mother, as if the simple gesture of wrapping her arms around her could shield them from any threat. Helen raised her head with an unsettling serenity. Her eyes shone, reflecting the fire, and in them there was no fear, but a mixture of curiosity and acceptance, as if she knew that sound brought with it a new chapter, although she couldn't yet guess what its nature would be. The steps became clearer, closer, until they stopped in front of the door, and in the silence that followed, Linda's heart pounded so hard it felt like it wanted to escape her chest. The wooden door moved slowly, and there, in the shadows of the threshold, appeared the figure of a tall man, with broad shoulders and a straight back, holding a hat in his hand with respect, like someone who knows that upon entering a stranger's space, one must announce oneself with humility. His face was weathered by the sun, and deep wrinkles framed dark eyes that looked firmly but without harshness, with the calm of one who has learned to measure his words before casting them to the wind. Linda swallowed and took a step back, feeling her legs tremble. But before she could say anything, the man spoke in a deep, clear voice, saying that this was his little house, the little house that had been forgotten since his wife died, and that although he used to visit it from time to time to keep the memory alive, it had been a long time since he had seen a fire lit within these walls. The echo of his words filled the cabin with a strange weight, because there was no anger in his tone, only a simple statement, as if he wanted them to acknowledge the truth before continuing. Helen slowly stood up, leaning on her cane, and with the dignity of her 92 years, she looked him straight in the eye without lowering her head. Linda, trembling, murmured that they had no other choice, that they had been left there without warning, that they didn't know where to go, and her words came out in broken, almost pleading gasps, because she feared that at any moment that man would throw them back out into the cold night. But James, because that's how he introduced himself later, remained silent for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, and during that time, his eyes scanned the scene. The makeshift fire on the floor, the rusty can still warm with the remains of boiled water, Linda's reddened hands, and Helen's serene face, which asked not for clemency, but for respect. Then he looked down at his hat, turned it in his hands as if organizing his thoughts, and finally raised his voice again to say that they should stay, that this place could remain empty or it could be filled with life, and that he preferred to hear laughter and see a fire lit than to find it again in silence and abandonment. The word "stay" echoed in the air like an unexpected balm, and Linda felt that tears were threatening to well up again, but this time they were not of fear or pain, but of deep relief. She put her hand to her chest and could barely articulate a thank you that came out as a whisper, while Helen slightly bowed her head with a solemn gesture, accepting the generosity without excessive emotion, as if she understood that life always puts the right people in your path at the right moment. James took a step inside, placed his hat on a rickety table, and said calmly that the next day he would bring some corn, that he would clean the dry well that was still behind the cabin, and that together they could make this place more dignified. Linda looked at him in amazement, trying to decipher if this was a dream or a tangible reality, and when her eyes met his, she knew he was not a man of empty words, that what he promised he would deliver because his voice carried the weight of truth. Helen then smiled discreetly, and in that smile there was some relief and some wisdom, as if confirming that even in the midst of abandonment, life never ceases to offer second chances. Outside, the wind began to blow again, and the distant caw of a crow was heard once more. But this time it didn't sound like a warning, but like a witness that something had changed in that cabin, that it was no longer just a refuge of pain, but the beginning of a new pact between fate and three souls who needed to find hope again. Linda took a deep breath, for the first time in a long time letting the tension fall from her shoulders, and silently promised herself that she would take advantage of this gesture of kindness, that she would transform this opportunity into life, and not more laments. Helen, with her gaze fixed on the fire, murmured almost to herself that no abandonment lasts forever when there are still hearts willing to share a roof and bread. And James, hearing these words, bowed his head in respect, as if he had just received a lesson from the mouth of an old woman who still held the strength of truth in every syllable. Over the next few years, James became their bridge to a world they had forgotten. He didn't lead them to the village at first. Instead, he brought the village to them, piece by piece. He spoke of the people, their struggles, and their small joys. Slowly, cautiously, Linda began to trade her intricate sewing for flour and salt with a hunter James knew. Helen's knowledge of wild herbs became a local legend after she helped cure the blacksmith's son of a persistent fever. They were no longer the abandoned women. They were the quiet healers of the woods, their story whispered with a mix of pity and awe. Their integration was not an event, but a slow, thawing spring after a long, hard winter. The villagers, initially wary, soon saw the quiet dignity in Helen and the resilient spirit in Linda. It was James's vouching for them that opened the first doors, and soon the curiosity of the village children brought a new, vibrant energy to the once silent cabin. At first, the connection was fragile. A woman from the village left a small basket of eggs on their porch without a word. Linda returned the gesture by mending the woman's son's torn shirt, leaving it neatly folded in the same basket. Helen earned their respect not with words, but with her quiet wisdom. When a child fell and scraped his knee, she calmly crushed a specific leaf she'd found in the forest and applied it to the wound, her steady hands a silent reassurance. News of these small acts of kindness and knowledge spread, weaving Linda and Helen into the fabric of the community, not as outsiders but as neighbors. James had kept his promise, and since dawn, he could be seen working with firm hands and his torso bent over the hard earth, digging a well that would bring water back to that forgotten corner of the forest. The metallic sound of the shovel hitting the stones mixed with the constant panting of his breath, and every movement of his strong arms raised small clouds of dust that the wind spread through the air. Under the relentless sun, sweat ran down his forehead and slid down his weathered cheeks, but his eyes remained fixed on the task, as if with each shovelful he was also burying the loneliness he had carried since his wife's death. He worked not just out of necessity, but out of a deep desire to see that place full of life again. And every time he looked up and saw Linda sewing in the shade of the porch, he found a new impulse to continue. She, with a needle in hand and a piece of cloth between her fingers, moved her hands with the delicacy of someone who has dedicated their life to transforming threads into warmth, and the almost imperceptible sound of the thread sliding through the cloth became a soft music that accompanied the dull thud of the shovel. Linda felt that sewing again restored some of her dignity, as if with each stitch she were also mending the invisible cracks in her own soul. And as she passed the needle back and forth, her gaze would occasionally lift to watch James, silently grateful for the presence that had changed her destiny. Helen, on the other hand, had found in the town's children a reason to get up every morning with enthusiasm. She would sit on a bench under the shade of a tree, surrounded by expectant little faces that watched her attentively, and with a slow and firm voice, she taught them to repeat old sayings that seemed to have been forgotten by the new generations. She would say, "He who sows the wind reaps the whirlwind," and the children would repeat in chorus, sometimes making mistakes, but always laughing, and she would correct them with infinite patience, enjoying seeing how those words full of folk wisdom were engraved in their young minds. She had recovered the spark that had characterized her in her youth, and her eyes would light up every time she heard a child repeat with conviction, Every cloud has a silver lining, as if in those fresh voices she could hear an echo of hope for the future. The rustic kitchen, with its walls blackened by smoke and its low wooden ceiling, transformed every afternoon into the heart of the new home. Linda and Helen worked together preparing a broth that filled the air with an aroma so warm and comforting that it seemed to embrace anyone who walked through the door. The smell of fresh herbs picked from the garden, mixed with the corn that James had brought from town and the vegetables that were slowly beginning to sprout in the earth, created a homely perfume that spread beyond the open windows, even attracting neighbors who passed by and greeted with a curious smile. While they stirred the pot, Linda commented that she never thought she would feel that simple joy of cooking for someone who truly appreciated it again. And Helen would reply that the secret to good broth was not in the ingredients, but in the intention with which it was prepared. They both laughed at the sound of the vegetables sizzling in the boiling water, because in that sound, they found confirmation that life was giving them a second chance. And while all this was happening, from a corner of the room, the old AM radio that James had rescued and patiently repaired began to play an old folk song, a nostalgic melody that spoke of impossible loves and long journeys and filled the cabin with an echo of other times. Listening to the music, Linda looked at her own hands. They were no longer the hands of the woman Scarlett had abandoned. They were the hands of a survivor. For years, she had wrestled with a ghost, the ghost of the daughter she had loved, the ghost of the life she had lost. But time, like the river outside, had smoothed the sharp edges of her grief. The anger had faded, replaced by a profound, aching pity. She no longer waited for Scarlett to return for her sake, but for Scarlett's. She prayed that one day her daughter would find a way to forgive herself. That had become her final, quiet hope. The singer's raspy voice mixed with the crackling of the firewood and the laughter of the children still running outside, creating an atmosphere so rich in humanity that anyone who had been there would have felt a lump in their throat. James, hearing the song while cleaning his sweaty hands with a rag, stood still for a moment, looking at the horizon, and murmured that his late wife used to sing that same folk song when she washed clothes by the river. Linda, hearing him, looked up from her sewing and replied softly that it was no coincidence then, that perhaps life was telling them that this house should not remain empty. Helen, listening to this brief conversation, smiled knowingly and added that when songs return, it's because they want to remind us that there is still much to live for. The warmth of the broth began to fill the makeshift bowls, and the aroma invaded every corner of the cabin. The music continued to play, and the children repeated sayings outside as if they were ancient mantras. And in this collection of images and sounds, a new, simple but luminous life was clearly drawn. A life that had been born from ruin and abandonment, but that flourished thanks to the kindness and shared strength of those who had decided not to give up. Linda with her needle in hand, Helen with her sayings, and James with his shovel and his radio formed an unexpected but beautiful picture. And although the world outside continued to be harsh and full of trials, inside that cabin now there was a home, there was laughter, there was food, and above all, there was a common heartbeat that gave meaning to their days again. The sun was beginning to set behind the pine trees, and the fresh evening air brought with it the damp scent of freshly turned earth, when an unexpected noise interrupted the quiet routine of the cabin. The sound of a distant engine broke the calm, a harsh roar that grew until it was present on the dusty road leading to the entrance. Helen, who at that moment was sitting on her wooden bench watching the children repeat for the last time the sayings she had taught them, raised her head with a frown and murmured that it wasn't the sound of a horse or a farmer's cart, but of a car coming too fast. Linda, who was sewing in the shade, immediately stopped the movement of her hands and clutched the fabric to her chest as a premonition ran through her skin like an icy current. The dust began to rise in the distance, thick and yellowish, and the echo of the engine made the town dogs bark nervously. James came out from the back where he had been checking the well and with his forehead covered in sweat, he wiped his hands on his pants and said in a serious tone that he wasn't expecting visitors, that almost no one used that road, except those who knew exactly where they were going. The car finally appeared through the cloud of dust, a vehicle that seemed to have lost its former shine, with scratched paint and worn tires, lurching forward as if it were about to stop for good at any moment. Linda felt her heart skip a beat, because as soon as she saw the female figure inside the car, she knew, although she tried to deny it, that it was her daughter. The car stopped with a screech of worn brakes in front of the cabin, and Scarlett slowly got out. But she was no longer the same woman with a hard gaze and cold expression who had left them there weeks ago, but a gaunt figure with a sunken face, reddened eyes and disheveled hair, as if she had spent entire nights without sleep. She wore a wrinkled dress and a jacket that was too big for her, and in her empty hands there was nothing to show but defeat. Linda put her hand to her mouth, unable to speak, while Helen remained motionless, watching her granddaughter with a mixture of severity and compassion. Scarlett took a few unsteady steps on the dirt, and then, as if the weight of her own regret brought her down, she knelt before them. The dust rose around her knees and stained her, but she didn't care. She simply lowered her head and began to sob with a force that shook her entire body. 20 years of silence, broken in an instant. This is the moment the entire story has been leading to. But forgiveness isn't simple, and the pain of betrayal runs deep. The question isn't just if they can forgive Scarlett, but how. Helen is about to deliver a lesson that will change all of their lives. In a voice choked and broken by years of unshed tears, she began to speak. The story of Michael's betrayal came out. Yes, but it was a minor detail in a much larger tragedy. She spoke of the hollow years that followed, of the fortune that turned to ash in her hands, of a loneliness so profound it felt like being buried alive. "It wasn't losing the money that broke me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It was the silence. Every night, for 20 years, I closed my eyes and saw your faces in the rear-view mirror. I lived in a prison I built for myself, brick by brick. I didn't come back because I lost everything. I came back because I finally understood that I had thrown away the only thing that was ever real." She said between sobs that she had sought out friends and family, and that everyone had turned their backs on her, that for the first time she understood what the word abandonment meant, and that in the midst of that emptiness, the only thing she wanted was to ask for forgiveness from her mother and grandmother for what she had done to them. Linda felt her legs give way and had to lean on the door frame to keep from falling, and with tears in her eyes, she said she didn't know if she should hug her immediately or confront her about the pain of so many nights of uncertainty. James watched the scene in silence, with his arms crossed and a grave face, understanding that this was a moment that belonged only to these 3 women, a moment that would define the rest of their lives. Helen, with her cane in hand, slowly approached until she stood in front of Scarlett. She looked down at her with her clear, firm eyes, and for a long moment she said nothing, letting the silence weigh more than any word. Scarlett looked up and pleaded for their forgiveness, for a chance to prove that she could change, and she bowed even lower until her forehead touched the damp earth, as if she wanted to sink into it with shame. Linda then gave in to her emotions. She ran to her daughter and lifted her by the shoulders, saying in a trembling voice that forgiving her cost her nothing, that the hard part had been surviving without her, that her absence had hurt more than any material betrayal. Scarlett clung to her mother's neck and cried in her lap as she did when she was a child, and that shared crying seemed to wash away layers of resentment built up over the years. Helen struck the ground with her cane, the sound echoing with the finality of a gavel. Her voice, though thin with age, carried the weight of 2 decades. "The house of wood and stone you lost was never the true home," she said, her eyes locking onto Scarlett's. "That home was a memory you chose to burn. This," she gestured to the humble cabin, the forest, the small community, "is a home built from ashes. You cannot enter it as the person who left." That person is a ghost. If you wish to enter, you must do so on your knees, not just in body, but in spirit. You must learn to serve, not to take, to heal, not to wound. That is the only door, and it is smaller than you can imagine." Scarlet nodded through her tears, accepting that condition as the only form of redemption. And in that gesture of surrender, there was more truth than in all the decisions she had made until then. James took a deep breath and finally approached, placing a firm hand on Scarlet's shoulder and saying that debts could be paid with honest work, that the earth always gives back what you give it, and that if she was willing to start from the bottom, she would not lack a roof or bread there. The afternoon was slowly fading, and the folk song that was still playing on the old radio seemed to accompany the moment as if it had been waiting for this return. The dust from the road gradually settled, and the air filled with a different kind of silence. Not the silence of loneliness, but of a pause in which life offers a new opportunity. Linda held her daughter. Helen firmly dictated the lesson of forgiveness, and James respectfully observed the rebirth of a family that had been on the verge of breaking forever. And in the midst of that trembling embrace, Scarlet discovered that although she had lost everything, she still had the most important thing left, the chance to start over from humility. Linda stood with her heart beating so hard she could hear the echo of her own pulse in her ears, and her eyes were filled with unshed tears that she didn't know whether to release or keep holding back, because in that moment of tension, every gesture could mean a definitive decision for the fate of the three of them. She looked at Scarlet kneeling on the ground, her face covered in dust and her trembling hands clinging to her knees, and within her, two irreconcilable forces fought. On one hand, the motherly instinct that screamed at her to lift her up and hold her in her arms to erase all the pain, and on the other, the memory of the endless nights in the empty cabin, the cold that seeped through the cracks, the look in her mother Helen's eyes when she murmured that they hadn't been left any food, and the certainty that all of this had been caused by her daughter's cruel decision. This doubt consumed her like a burning ember in her chest, and as her lips parted without being able to form a word, Scarlet lifted her tear-streaked face and in a broken voice said to forgive them, that she wasn't asking for riches or comfort, that the only thing she needed was a chance to show that she could be different, that she had learned from her mistake, and that without them, she felt more alone than ever. Every word from Scarlet fell like a blow to Linda's heart, because she recognized in that torn tone the same voice of the child who once cried in her arms after a nightmare, and the contrast with the woman who had abandoned them was so great that it confused and disarmed her. She leaned forward a little, still hesitating, and extended a trembling hand as if to stroke her daughter's hair, but withdrew it halfway because she feared that gesture would erase in one fell swoop the right to claim for so much pain. The atmosphere was charged with a tension that was almost palpable, and at that moment Helen, who until then had maintained an imposing silence, lifted her cane with both hands and struck the dirt floor hard, producing a dry sound that echoed in the cabin like thunder. All eyes turned to her, and the old woman, standing tall with the dignity that the years had not managed to break, fixed her eyes on Scarlet with a mixture of severity and tenderness. She took a deep breath, and in a clear voice that allowed no interruptions, she pronounced the sentence that would change everything, saying that the home had always been hers, that nothing and no one could take that right away from her, but that if she wanted to enter again, she had to do so through the small door, the door of humility and true repentance. Upon hearing these words, a heavy silence spread through the place, broken only by Scarlet's choked sobs as she nodded her head again and again, acknowledging that there was no other way but to accept that condition. Linda let out a deep sigh, and the tears she had held back until then burst forth uncontrollably, falling on her daughter's face, who was still clinging to her knees. Then, unable to resist the internal struggle any longer, Linda finally bent down and wrapped her arms around her, burying her face in her tangled hair and repeating in a trembling voice that the hardest part had been surviving without her, that no resentment could be stronger than a mother's love. Scarlett, through tears and with a choked voice, replied that she would work, that she would serve, that she would do whatever was necessary to repair the damage, that she accepted entering through that small door because she knew she deserved nothing else after what she had done. Helen watched the scene with moist eyes, but without losing the firmness of her expression, and murmured that life teaches with hard blows, that there is no redemption without humility, and that the important thing was not to forget what had happened, but to learn from it. James, who was standing a little apart, crossed his arms and nodded in silence, moved by the strength of that old woman who had transformed a moment of breakdown into a life lesson. Outside, the wind rustled the tops of the pine trees, and a ray of sun filtered through a crack in the door, illuminating the dust suspended in the air, like tiny golden sparks blessing the scene. In that instant, between the crying, the words of forgiveness, and the sentence of wisdom, not only was a wound being closed, but a new path was being opened, a difficult but possible path, where forgiveness was not an empty gift, but a pact of responsibility and love. Linda lifted her daughter from the floor with effort. Scarlett let herself be held like a tired child, and together they turned to Helen, who, with her cane held high, seemed stronger than ever, like an old tree that withstands storms. The judgment of the heart had been delivered, and although the scars of the past would continue to mark their souls, from that moment on they began to write a different story, woven with threads of humility, learning, and a love that, despite everything, refused to die. This isn't just forgiveness, it's a blueprint for redemption. Helen understands that a true apology isn't a word but an action. Scarlett has been given a chance, but the road ahead is paved with hard work and humility. Let's see if she has the strength to walk it. Scarlett was kneeling by the riverbank. The icy water bit at her fingers as she patiently scrubbed a shirt that had once belonged to James, and her rough hands, which before had only counted dollar bills behind a bank window, now knew the hardness of the stone and the cheap soap. The morning sun reflected on the water's surface, creating flashes that momentarily blinded her. But she did not look away from her task, because she understood that her recovered dignity was at stake in this simple act, and every piece of clothing she rinsed was like a piece of guilt being shed from her skin. She said nothing, and that humble silence weighed more than any words, because it spoke of a sincere surrender, of a heart that had understood that it was impossible to go back, but that it was possible to start anew from the very basics. The birds sang in the nearby branches, and from time to time a stronger current of the river would splash her. But Scarlett did not complain. She just bowed her head and continued scrubbing, her hair stuck to her face with sweat and water, as if the river itself were baptizing her into a new life. A short distance away, Linda watched her from a fallen log where she had left her sewing. After a while, when the sound of the water and the rubbing of the cloth filled the air, she got up and walked towards her with gentle steps. She bent down, took a threaded needle and thread from her pocket, and with a voice choked with emotion she said, "Sew with me." Scarlett looked up, and her eyes, red from exhaustion and crying, met her mother's, which shone with a mixture of tenderness and melancholy. She didn't answer immediately, because the lump in her throat wouldn't let her speak, but she took the needle with trembling hands and nodded in silence, as if in that small gesture she were accepting an alliance that went far beyond sewing. Linda sat beside her on the damp grass, and together they began to pass the thread through the cloth, their hands working side by side in a rhythmic back and forth that seemed like a secret language. Linda, in a soft voice, began to explain the importance of each stitch, of not letting the thread get tangled, because otherwise the fabric would become distorted. And Scarlett listened as if each instruction were also a life lesson, as if those words hid the metaphor of a broken bond they were now trying to mend. Helen watched from a distance, sitting on her bench under the shade of a tree, and seeing them side by side, She couldn't help but smile. It was a calm, deep smile, full of pride, because in that scene she saw her deepest wish fulfilled, the return of the unity that had been snatched away by resentment. With her eyes narrowed by the sunlight and the murmur of the river in the background, she thought that no wealth could equal the value of that moment, and that, despite all the suffering, life had been generous enough to give her the opportunity to see her daughter and granddaughter together, not at odds. She murmured to herself that the river always returns what belongs to it, and that phrase hung in the air like a silent prayer that mixed with the birds' song. Meanwhile, James was returning from town with firm steps, carrying a kerosene lantern on his shoulder that he had bought with the little he had managed to sell at the market. He reached the porch of the cabin, lifted the lantern, and hung it on the highest nail he could find. And when the flame was lit, casting a yellowish light that illuminated the entrance, he said in a serene voice that this light would be there every night so that they would never again feel absolute darkness. Scarlet raised her head upon hearing these words and saw the lantern's flame sway gently in the breeze. In that movement, she recognized a metaphor for her own life, fragile, oscillating, but finally lit. Linda took her daughter's hand and squeezed it tightly, and Scarlet, with silent tears, replied that she did not deserve so much kindness, but that she would do everything possible to live up to this new opportunity. It's in these small, quiet moments that the deepest healing occurs. More powerful than any tearful confession, this simple act of Linda asking Scarlet to sew with her is a promise. It's the beginning of a new chapter, where every shared meal and every lesson learned helps to build a home from the ashes of betrayal. Don't go anywhere, because the final moments of their story will show you what a true family looks like. Helen, listening from her corner, added in a clear voice that no one deserved or ceased to deserve their family's love, that love simply existed and had to be cultivated like the lantern's fire, making sure it never went out due to neglect. The river continued to flow, the clean clothes piled up on the stones, the needles continued to sew worn fabrics, and the newly hung lantern shone like a promise at the cabin's entrance. That afternoon transformed into a symbol of rebirth, a picture where every simple gesture, washing, sewing, teaching, lighting, contained the weight of a reconstructed life. Scarlet had returned on her knees, humiliated, but now she stood up with sincere humility. Linda regained the hope of not being alone in the final stretch of her days. Helen saw the seed of forgiveness blossom in her own family, and James found in that shared home the echo of a companionship he thought he had lost forever. The kerosene lantern burned as a witness, and as the afternoon turned golden and the sounds of the countryside mixed with the timid laughter of mother and daughter, the forgotten cabin slowly transformed into a true home, supported not by firm walls, but by hearts that had finally learned to find each other again. The days had begun to have a different rhythm in that cabin that once only knew silence and dust, and the sound that now announced life was that of the children from the village, who ran along the path, kicking up a light cloud of dust, while their laughter echoed among the pine trees. They arrived barefoot, with their cheeks flushed from the sun and their eyes bright with curiosity, knowing that in that house there was always something new to learn or share. The childish uproar filled the air with a fresh joy that contrasted with the memory of the dark days when the only noise had been the wind seeping through the cracks. Linda, who saw them arrive with a broad smile, came out to greet them with a basket of freshly made cornbread, which still gave off the warm aroma of firewood and toasted flour. With trembling but tender hands, she distributed a generous piece to each child, and as she did so, she told them to eat it slowly, because bread tasted better when it was appreciated. The little ones sat on the ground or on nearby stones, chewing eagerly and sharing crumbs amidst laughter, and Linda watched them with moist eyes, remembering the girl Scarlet had once been, running with the same innocence through the dusty yards of her childhood. Scarlet, meanwhile, kept busy in the vegetable garden that James had helped build next to the cabin. The sun beat down on her back and wet her forehead with sweat, but she didn't complain. On the contrary, she leaned over the earth with determination, pulling weeds, watering the furrows, and patiently arranging the tender corn and tomato plants. James, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hat covering his face, worked beside her, teaching her how to distinguish the good seed from the one that bore no fruit, and from time to time he would look at her with a serious but respectful expression, recognizing in her sincere effort the will for redemption. Scarlett responded with humility, saying that she still had much to learn, but that she was in no hurry, that every drop of sweat shed was part of the debt she owed her mother and grandmother. And James would reply that the earth does not judge, that it only gives back what one gives it, and that if she worked with faith, sooner or later she would reap fruits that would nourish not only her body, but also her spirit. She smiled gratefully, and for the first time in many years she felt pride in seeing her hands dirty with soil, because that dirt was a symbol of a rebirth. Inside the cabin, Helen was preparing for the most important moment of the day, the one when everyone gathered around the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, giving off a delicious smell of broth with fresh herbs, and the air was permeated with familiar aromas that invited one to stay. When the children finished their bread, they curiously approached the door, and the old woman received them with a solemn gesture. In a slow and firm voice, she asked everyone to sit around the improvised table made of old planks, and seeing them all gathered there, a mix of children, mother, daughter, and James, she raised her trembling hands to the sky and pronounced a simple but powerful blessing, saying that she was grateful for every grain of corn, for every drop of water, for every shared smile, and above all, for the opportunity to see her family united again. Linda bowed her head and silently repeated her mother's words, while Scarlett closed her eyes and let the emotion run through her body like a warm river. James lowered his hat as a sign of respect, and the children, although they did not fully understand the depth of those words, remained silent for a moment, infected by the solemnity of the moment. The sounds of the forest accompanied the scene with the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind in the branches, as if nature itself were joining the celebration. Helen concluded the blessing by saying that, where there is bread and family, there is no lack of a home, and with that phrase, she began the meal. Everyone began to serve themselves, sharing plates and laughter, and in every gesture you could feel the human warmth that had once seemed to have disappeared from their lives. Linda watched her daughter leaning over the table, laughing softly as she served broth to the children, and felt that the wound of abandonment was slowly closing with the invisible thread of these shared moments. Scarlett, seeing her mother's gaze, got up and took her hand gently, saying that she would never again allow resentment to separate her from what really mattered. And Linda replied that forgiveness is not measured in words, but in deeds, and that seeing her there, serving with humility, was the clearest proof that she had chosen the right path. James watched them in silence, with a glint of satisfaction in his eyes, knowing that he had planted something more than vegetables. He had helped cultivate a family that was flourishing in the midst of adversity. The afternoon turned golden as the sun set, and the laughter of the children mixed with the distant sound of the radio that was playing again in the corner of the room. The kerosene lantern hanging on the porch waited for the moment to be lit, promising that the light would continue when night came. And in that image of a simple table surrounded by hands sharing bread, broth, and affection, the new family found the certainty that the painful past did not define their destiny, but that faith, work, and love could write a different future. A future where every day would be celebrated as a gift, and every hug would be a reminder that even after betrayal and loss, life always offers the opportunity to start over. The sun was beginning to set slowly over the horizon, and the entire forest seemed to pause to watch the spectacle of the sunset, as if nature itself wanted to witness that moment that was not common, but a daily miracle, born of reconciliation. The golden light filtered through the tall tops of the pine trees and entered through the cracks of the cabin, bathing with its warm glow the faces of three women who had once been separated by deep wounds, but who now shared the same calm. Helen, at 92 years old, and with a gaze as clear as spring water, received that light on her wrinkled skin, and it seemed that every furrow on her face was illuminated with a special meaning, as if the marks of the years were now symbols of strength and wisdom. Beside her was Linda, calmer than at any other time since the abandonment, with her lips gently curved into a serene smile that reflected the peace of having recovered her daughter. Scarlett, with her hair tousled by the breeze and her eyes still moist from so many shed tears, let the light caress her face, and in that mixture of brightness and dampness, her eyes seemed like mirrors containing the promise of a new beginning. 3 generations, 3 different faces, but united by the same blood, were immortalized in that instant like a living painting where life, after so many trials, showed itself to be generous and reconciling. The silence of the afternoon was gently broken by Helen's humming, who with a trembling voice began to sing an old song she had learned as a child in the fields of Ohio. She didn't remember all the words, but the melody remained intact in her memory. A melody that spoke of plantings, of rains, and of hopes, and that now sounded like a lullaby intended to calm not only those who listened to it, but also her own soul. Linda looked at her tenderly and said that the song reminded her of the nights of her childhood when, lying on a mat, she would listen to her mother sing it so that the fear of the dark would dissipate. Helen replied that songs never die, that they just wait for the right moment to return, and that perhaps now that tune was returning because it had found the peace it needed to be reborn on her lips. Scarlett, sitting on the bench next to them, closed her eyes and let her grandmother's voice envelop her like a cloak. And she felt that this song was also an invisible caress, reminding her that there were still deep roots that supported her, that even though she had erred in the past, the sap of love continued to flow in that family. The air inside the cabin was filled with a delicious aroma coming from the rustic kitchen, where Linda was preparing hot coffee. With steady hands and slow movements, she poured the dark, strong liquid into steaming clay mugs, filling the room with an unmistakable perfume. As she placed each mug on the table, Linda said that there was no coffee tastier than the one drunk at the end of a peaceful day, and her words resonated as a simple but undeniable truth. Helen took hers with both hands, slowly bringing it to her lips, and upon tasting the first sip, she sighed deeply, saying that the warmth was like a hug in her chest. Scarlett received her mug and held it carefully, watching the steam rise in spirals towards the blackened ceiling, and she thought that each turn of the vapor was like a representation of her own life, which had risen, fallen, and dispersed, but in the end, always rose again. Linda looked at her with a knowing smile and commented that serving coffee for her mother and her daughter was a gift she never imagined having again. And Scarlett, her voice choked with emotion, replied that sitting down to drink with them at that table was more valuable than anything she had had in the past. As Helen's singing faded softly and the aroma of coffee filled every corner, Scarlett couldn't contain her emotion and smiled with wet eyes. A smile that was not of triumph or pride, but of humility and gratitude. The tears rolled slowly down her cheeks, but this time they were not tears of guilt or shame, but of relief, because she felt that she had finally found her place, a place that had always been there, but that she had blindly rejected. She said in a low voice that she was finally at peace, that for the first time in many years her heart didn't feel as heavy as a stone. And Linda, hearing these words, reached out and gently stroked her hair as she did when she was a child, saying that peace is the greatest treasure a mother can wish for her children. Helen, her gaze fixed on the flame of the lantern that James had lit on the porch, added serenely that life had hit them hard, but it had also taught them that no darkness is eternal as long as there is the will to light a light. Outside, the night began to cover the forest, and the chirping of the crickets mixed with the gentle breeze that moved the branches. But inside the cabin, everything seemed suspended in a state of fullness. James, who had remained silent, approached the door and observed the scene from there. 3 women gathered around a simple table, sharing coffee and smiles after having crossed a desert of pain. He said to himself that this was true wealth, that no gold could compare to the peace that was breathed in that reborn home. In that instant, he understood that he was not alone, that he had also found a family that welcomed him, and lowering his hat as a sign of respect, he took a step back to give them their space, although inside he knew that he was already part of that story. The epilogue of their lives was not a tragic end, but a sunrise disguised as a sunset, because although the sun was hiding on the horizon, a new clarity was dawning in their hearts. Helen was humming, Linda was serving coffee, and Scarlett was smiling with wet eyes. And that simple but powerful combination became the most valuable image of all. The proof that after betrayal, abandonment, and pain, it is still possible to find peace when forgiveness is offered and received with humility. There, in that cabin lost among the pine trees, in the warmth of the fire and under the golden light that caressed their faces, 3 women of different generations had learned that a true home is not made of walls or properties, but of the unbreakable union of hearts that decide to stay together despite everything. And so, their story comes to a gentle close, not with a grand fanfare, but with the quiet warmth of a cup of coffee and a shared, peaceful silence. They show us that the deepest wounds can heal, and that a true home isn't a place you find, but something you build from forgiveness. Their journey is a powerful reminder that it is never, ever too late to start over. The story of Linda, Helen, and Scarlett teaches us a powerful truth. The deepest wounds are not inflicted by enemies, but by those we love. Yet, it also shows us that the human heart has an infinite capacity for resilience, and that it is never, ever too late to find the small door of humility. Their home, born from abandonment, became a beacon of hope, proving that true wealth is not what we own, but the love we are willing to rebuild from the ground up. If their journey from ashes to peace resonated with your soul, share this story with someone who needs to hear that hope is never lost. Click like if you believe in the power of forgiveness, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the strength we all hold within. Now, I turn it over to you. In the comments below, tell me, what does the word home